In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren.
Paul the Apostle is thought to have been born some 2,000 years ago in Tarsus under the name of Saul. He claimed he was a Pharisee at the time of his conversion to a follower of Christ. He's known to history as the Apostle to the Gentiles. The narrow Belen Pass on the southern tip of Turkey, called the Gates of Syria by the Romans, has connected Asia Minor and the Middle East since ancient times. It was traversed by armies, traders, and the Apostle Paul. It's fascinating to think of it, says Luigi Padovese, a 55-year-old church historian from Milan and Catholic Bishop of Anatolia.
It's highly probable that Paul came through this pass several times. Everything here reminds us of Paul, even though he's been almost forgotten in Turkey. If it hadn't been for Paul and the other missionaries, we wouldn't be Christians today.
This is the real cradle of the Christian Church, not Jerusalem or Rome. Today, in the region where Paul began his ministry, Bishop Padovese ministers to the Catholic community of southern and eastern Turkey. He might have to drive as far as 1,300 kilometers, and riding beside him the entire way is a bodyguard from the local police. The bishop has received a number of threats. The episcopal see of the Anatolian diocese is Iskenderun, the ancient port city of Alexandretta. Iskenderun is still a major centre of trade. Citrus fruit and grain from the surrounding countryside are brought to market here. The Syrian border curves around the city to the south and east. Several oil pipelines from the Arab countries reach the sea here. The bishop lives with 7 priests and nuns from various countries behind the walls of the Apostolic Vicariate in the centre of Iskenderun. This padre comes from Romania. At weekends, the Vicariate's courtyard is open to the local children. The good-natured bishop has won the hearts of his community, especially the children. At the same time, he's a fighter. The Roman Catholic Church isn't recognized by Turkey as a legal entity, so it's not allowed to purchase or own property. Bishop Padovese has to deal with other obstacles as well.
Ich bin de facto hier als Bischof.
In reality, I'm here as bishop, but legally, as far as the Turkish authorities are concerned, I don't exist. That has a number of consequences. For example, we can't open a seminary and train candidates, and that has resulted in the Turkish Catholic Church being led by non-Turks.
A Mass in the Church of the Annunciation, the Vicariate's own diocesan church. The Anatolian Catholic community is estimated at 3,500 members in all. And not even the bishop knows a more exact number. Conditions in the Christian diaspora have led to a blurring of the lines between the various denominations and even the major churches. Armenians, Syriac Orthodox, Protestants, and even the occasional curious Muslim are all welcome to discuss and profess their faiths in Turkish at the church in Iskenderun. Any Turk who practices Christianity can expect problems, whether in professional or private life. And converts make instant enemies of both Turkish nationalists and fundamentalist Muslims alike. 2,000 years after Paul's missionary work in Asia Minor, proselytizing may be legal in modern-day Turkey, but it can provoke a hostile response or even attacks. Christians here, of whatever creed, keep a low profile.
Sometimes when you come out of the church, young people hurl abuse at you. They yell, "You infidel! What do you believe in anyway? You're dirty," and things like that. And then they also keep on spraying insults like that on the walls of the church. We have to have the walls completely repainted at least 8 times a year.
In February 2006, in Trabzon, Father Andrea Santoro was murdered by a fanatic young Islamist. He was one of the priests of the Anatolian diocese. The Vicariate established the Don Andrea Santoro Center for Intercultural and Interfaith Dialogue in his memory. Now representatives of the various churches and of Islam gather here regularly for symposia.
Just like my late brother, I'm convinced that it must be possible, especially for us Christians, to spread the spirit of peace and reconciliation, even among our adversaries.
200 kilometers west of Iskenderun, the city of Tarsus is making preparations for the Pauline year and the 2000th birthday of its most famous son. The townspeople, Muslim and Christian alike, are looking forward to the wave of Bible tourists from the west.
I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city.
Paul expressed pride in his hometown. St. Paul's Well marks the site where his parents' house is said to have stood. Unlike most Jews of his time, Paul possessed the rights of a Roman citizen. It's not clear whether Paul ever returned to his hometown during his missionary journeys. A church bearing his name has stood in Tarsus for several hundred years. Today it's a museum. Should Christians wish to worship here, they have to obtain permission from the municipal authorities. A surprisingly well-preserved Roman road leads past the city. Paul travelled roads such as this, following the call to go forth on his missionary journeys. Paul set out on all 3 of his missionary journeys from Antioch on the Orontes River, known today as Antakya. In ancient times, with a population of several 100,000, it was the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire. An estimated 1/5 of its people were Jews. It was important centres of commerce such as this, along with the relatively dense population of Asia Minor, that facilitated that rapid spread of Christianity. The early Christian community here claimed the Apostle Peter as their founder. Modern-day Antakya's bazaar still offers handcrafted goods much resembling the ones bought and sold here in Paul's day. A mule saddler. Even now, mules are an indispensable means of transport in the rugged southeast of Turkey. Paul arrived in Antioch sometime around the year 40 AD to help out his fellow missionary Barnabas. The city became the home base for their mission to the heathens.
And it came to pass that the whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. And the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch.
The remains of the ancient port of Seleucia Pieria, near modern-day Samandağ, 20 kilometers down the coast from Antioch. The mountains of Syria rise in the distance. The Roman proconsul Titus had a canal built here to divert the Orontes River away from the port in an attempt to keep it from silting up in the harbour basin. The waterway was carved into the living rock for 1,400 metres, one of the largest-scale engineering projects Rome ever undertook in its provinces. Not far from the tunnel, a number of tombs are cut into the rock. Seleucia was Cilicia's gateway to the rest of the world. From this port, Paul and Barnabas set out on their first missionary journey to Cyprus, Barnabas's homeland. They landed at Salamis, at the time the island's principal city, where they founded the first Cypriot Christian community. The Acts of the Apostles describes Barnabas as a good man and full of the Holy Ghost and of faith. After travelling for decades as a missionary, he returned to Salamis, where tradition has it he met a martyr's death. Inside a monastery in Salamis, there's a tomb reputed to hold his remains. From Salamis, Paul and Barnabas travelled on to Paphos, then the capital of Cyprus. There, according to legend, they were bound to this pillar and flogged. But the Bible has no mention of the incident. To the contrary, it relates that the two apostles even succeeded in converting the Roman proconsul, making Cyprus the first land under Christian rule, if only for a short time. Back in the Apostolic Vicariate of Anatolia, Bishop Parovese has invited representatives of the other Oriental churches to a symposium. One of the aims of the Pauline year is to reaffirm the common heritage of all Christians. The Syriac Orthodox Church grew out of the Christian community in Antioch. After the original followers of Christ in Jerusalem, it's the oldest of all Christian communities. The language used in its liturgy is Aramaic, the language of Jesus. But the Syriac Orthodox Church, like so many others, is in decline. Scarcely 12,000 members still live in Turkey. The others are scattered all over the world.
We live in this country and want to do our part for peace and reconciliation as Christians. The work of the Apostle Paul helps us to do it. He's the mortar that holds us together.
Paul is an example for all Christians, but even more so in Turkey, where we live as Christians in danger of losing our own identity.
Ein Beispiel für alle Christen.
On his second and third missionary journeys, Paul went to Ephesus in Asia Minor. At the time, it was the fourth largest city in the empire after Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. As told in the Acts of the Apostles, he was drawn into a dispute in the city's great amphitheatre. The dispute was started by a silversmith called Demetrius, who was apparently worried that Paul's mission might cut into his livelihood as a maker of statuettes of Artemis and other pagan devotional objects. The city's temple, dedicated to Artemis, numbered among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it drew visitors in droves. Many of them stopped to listen to Paul and his monotheistic message. That didn't bode well for the silversmith's business. The clash got Paul thrown into prison, where he wrote or dictated some of his epistles. High above the ruins of Ephesus stand some old fortified walls traditionally known as Paul's prison, but archaeologists have established a far more recent date for them. In the late 1990s, a fresco was discovered on the wall of a cave near Ephesus. It proved to be one of the earliest portraits of the Apostle Paul ever identified. The historical Constantinople, later Byzantium, capital of the Byzantine Empire, is now Istanbul, the modern business and cultural metropolis of Turkey, straddling Europe and Asia. The Catholic St. Paul's congregation, with about 200 members, is one of 3 German-speaking Christian communities in Istanbul. The German consul here estimates the number of German expatriates living in the Istanbul area at about 6,000. Father Peter Wehr came to the Turkish megalopolis from Berlin in 2005 to serve as the congregation's priest.
Our congregational life is very similar to what it would be in Germany. What we don't do is publicize ourselves, because all the rules emphasize that these are foreigners, and as such, they can practice their religion here in Turkey. The members of our congregation are either German citizens or other Western Europeans.
The St. Paul's congregation offers coffee and bingo for older people in the rectory garden, in addition to a youth club, First Communion and continuing education courses. One of the guests is a 100-year-old woman who's been in Turkey since 1928.
If they pick me up, I come. There's nothing else to do. I live alone.
Father Wehr is fascinated by this city of 12 million people, even if life in Istanbul can be fairly hectic. The traffic congestion can be almost traumatic. It's not hard to find a taxi, but getting anywhere in it is quite another matter. The former summer residence of the German ambassador near the Bosphorus is now a house of German-Turkish dialogue. This day, a delegation from the German parliament is in town. Attending the reception is part of Father Wehr's official duties. But it's also an opportunity for him to lobby for some high-level support. The German government is aware of the legal and other issues foreign church communities have to face in Turkey.
To say that everyone has a right to practice their religion, but then when they do it together with others, they run into trouble, that's unacceptable.
I can make out some progress on the Turkish side, but that progress is still far too sluggish. And for a country that hopes to become a member of the European Union, it's still far too little.
On a piece of land facing the Bosphorus and owned by the German state, there's an old German military cemetery holding the remains of soldiers who fell in the First World War. Germans of every ilk have long felt drawn to this city: merchants, craftsmen and adventurers. Even after Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, German-speaking Catholics often found their way to the city now called Istanbul. Many of them came as monks and pilgrims. For centuries, the Christians from abroad lived in relative harmony with the Muslim majority. Christians had always lived in Asia Minor. But recently, isolated incidents of violence have begun to poison the atmosphere.
The attacks on Christians in Turkey have in fact had an effect, both on myself and on the community. On the advice of the Consulate General, we've tightened our security measures. For example, there's no free access to the church services on Sunday anymore. Only those who know the path through our garden can find their way to the Mass. The entrance from the street is kept locked.
willkommen. Herr Kretschmann, grüß Sie, Frau Wehr. Nett, dass Sie bei uns zu haben. Das ist sehr schön.
Father Wehr drops in on the Kretschmans to have some coffee and cake and listen to his flock's cares and woes. The Kretschmans have been living in Istanbul for over 20 years and have been with the congregation for nearly as long. They both work in the German schools. They agree that the harassment comes not only from individual fanatics, but from the state as well, although there's no ill feeling towards Christians among the Turkish people. On the contrary, life can be quite pleasant for German Christians in Istanbul.
At first, when our children were still little, I thought I'd have to be cautious in an Islamic environment and not give any outward sign that I'm Christian. Who knows what the neighbors would think if I were to hang stars in my window at Christmas or a wreath on my door for Advent. But over the years, I've noticed that people here are very accepting of us. We sing in choirs for many of the Christian congregations in Istanbul, and I wouldn't say there's ever a problem. I feel the need to pray in my own language, and that's why the German-speaking congregation is so important to me. I speak English and French, so I could go to one of the other foreign congregations, and I have in the past, but it's just not the same for me.
They discuss the music for the Pentecostal Mass. This year it celebrates the birthday of the church in the land where it was born. The Mass is to be held in the St. Paul's Chamber. The tiny flock of German Catholics in Turkey see the Apostle as their patron saint and dedicate whatever they can to his name.
Den Frieden für die Völker, dass die Bemühungen der Nationen durch das Wirken des Gottesgeistes zur Einheit und Gleichberechtigung aller Menschen führen. Lasse zum Herrn uns beten, Herr, erbarme dich.
The members of the St. Paul's congregation had many reasons for coming to Turkey. Some are teachers, diplomats or business people. Others married Turkish citizens. But whatever their motives, they all share an awareness that the earliest church took its first crucial steps in their host country, Turkey, the Asia Minor of ancient times.
For our congregation, which is made up mostly of people who stay in Turkey for just a few years, it means something special to know that they lived where it all first happened.
The St. Paul's congregation is planning a pilgrimage to the birthplace of Paul the Apostle. The Archbishop of Cologne, Joachim Cardinal Meissner, has petitioned the official Turkish Islamic Union and the government itself for permission to build a church in Tarsus. An alternative would be for the state to return the existing antique church, which it confiscated and made into a museum, so it could be used for its intended purpose.
Tarsus könnte das Signal sein, wenn Sie uns diese Gelegenheit
Tarsus could send out a signal. If they give us this opportunity, we'd have reason to hope for a future in Turkey.
Wenn Sie verschlossen bleiben,
if they slam the door on us, we'll stay as we are, without any real prospects.
Aber keine große Perspektive.
For the Christians of Turkey, the Pauline year brings this promise of hope for a renewal of the faith and the commitment of the faithful to their church, of the hope that the spirit of its teachings may guide Christians in their worship, their work, and their striving toward unity. They take courage from the example of the suffering and hardship the Apostle Paul endured throughout his 3 missionary journeys until his death in a Roman prison. Just as great an example is the understanding he showed to those of other faiths here in the home country of Paul the Apostle.